Okay, welcome to the review for Exam 1. So basically what I'm going to be doing here is running through module by module, talking about the important topics and a quick review of, again, what I think are some of the more important things that we should know about this. Clearly I'm not going to be able to reteach all these modules, but you're always free to go back and view the videos again. Please also note that there is a printed version of this, or a version you can look up of this guide, not only here in the video, but also in the D2L shell, as well as a discussion board, which will remain open the majority of the week. You can see the deadline as far as when it will close within the module. But basically, as you are viewing this video and reviewing your notes and reviewing your reading from the text, you can follow along, as I said, with the guide on your own, making notes, and any questions you might have, please feel free to post in the discussion board, which will be available until about midweek, and then the exam, of course, is due by the end of the week. Okay? So let's take a look. In Module 1, we talked about basically the sociological perspective, or what we sometimes also refer to as sociological imagination. We talked about the origins of sociology, so again, the historical context in which sociology became into being. We talked about some of the founders of sociological theory. Clearly we talked about Auguste Comte and his contributions as far as coining the term sociology, as well as laying the foundation for what sociology would be with his talk of positivism, as well as an emphasis on social reform. Then we talked about Herbert Spencer and discussed his views that somewhat contradicted Comte, not all of them, of course, but certainly his ideas. And we talked about the misappropriation of the phrase survival of the fittest, which was a phrase that came from Spencer, in talking about the idea of opposing the idea of changing society, because that would only make it weaker. We talked about Karl Marx and his ideas of, which would later become conflict theory, but his ideas of groups in society competing for resources. Of course, he talked about basically the haves and have-nots, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and their opposing goals as far as society goes, as well as some of the, like I said, misconceptions about Karl Marx, that he was not a founder of the Soviet Union, and largely he was upset with how a lot of his theories were misconstrued politically. Durkheim and his ideas. Emile Durkheim, most famous, of course, probably for his work, the study of suicide. We talked about the fact that that was very important to sociology being recognized as a discipline because of the scope and nature of that very famous experiment. We also talked about Durkheim later on as a person who contributed greatly to the ideas of social cohesion and social integration. Then we talked, of course, about Max Weber and his ideas. Again, in this part of the chapter, we talked mainly about his contributions to the fundamentals of social research, as well as his opposition to a lot of the thoughts on Marx, especially when it came to topics about religion. So just again, being familiar, notice I don't have any of their dates up there, as we talked about during the videos and when we went through here. Those dates might be in your notes. While those dates put them in the historical context in which we're discussing, it's not necessarily for you to memorize those dates. Then we talked about how sociology came to the U.S. So we talked about the University of Chicago and the founding of the very first Department of Sociology, as well as the first Journal of Sociology. We talked about Jane Addams and her work in the Hull House, which was basically a precursor to a lot of what we probably call the social services today. We talked about W.E.B. Du Bois being a son of former slaves in the late part of the 19th century, earlier part of the 20th century, and his studies on racism in the United States. We talked about Talcott Parsons, who along with Robert Merton contributed greatly to what we'll discuss in just a little bit, that idea of functionalism, the fact that society is comprised of various parts that work together to form the greater whole. And C. Wright Mills, a sociologist who talked a lot about the foundations or structure of power in our society and predicted a power elite that was coming into form, he said, during his lifetime in the 20th century. Then we talked about the basic fundamental or sociological perspectives. So we definitely talked about the idea, excuse me if I can just move that up a little bit, I guess not, that we can look at any kind of sociological phenomenon from three basic perspectives. There's of course many other types which are either combinations of or sub kind of topics within these, but the three basic fundamental perspectives: symbolic interaction, which is a micro-sociological outlook, which talks about defining society and its phenomenon by the changing meanings of symbols in society. We talked about functionalism, once again, that idea that society is very much like a living organism with all the various parts working together to form the greater whole. And if you want to understand phenomena in society, it's important to understand the structure and function of the various aspects of society and how they interact with one another. And then conflict theory, which again we just mentioned when we talked about Marx, that idea that society is comprised of different groups that compete for resources and also engage in the struggle for authority within society. So those are our three basic perspectives. And we wrapped up Module 1 by talking about sociological research. We talked about we talked about the stages of conducting research, as well as many of the various methods for conducting research. But most importantly, we talked about how to go about conducting a sociological experiment and some of the very important terms that go along with that. Once again, hypothesis, an educated guess about the expected outcome of conducting an experiment or research. The sample being the total number of the population being studied and how important it is to critically define a sample when doing research. And then, of course, the independent and dependent variables, which, when we talk about an experiment, we talk about dividing your sample up into experimental and then control groups, with the idea that the independent variable is presented or given, or the experimental group is exposed to it. In other words, that thing that we expect to cause change, and then the control group does not get the independent variable. And then the dependent variable are those things that we expect to see changed as a result of exposure to the independent variable. So again, just those very important terms in relation to defining what a sociological experiment would be. Okay, then in Module 2, we talked about culture and how important defining culture is for understanding society. We talked about the differences between symbolic and material culture, the idea that symbolic culture is exactly that, centered around symbols or abstractions, things that are generally considered to be thoughts or ideas, whereas material culture is more of the realm of things that have substance, or in other words, things we can touch. We talked about the definitions between ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. So ethnocentrism being generally the belief that one's own culture to be the center of things. Again, take it to an extreme, that could certainly lead to intolerance of other cultures or prejudice or discrimination against other cultures. But of course, we talked about some positive benefits of ethnocentrism as well. We also then compared that with cultural relativism, the attempt to understand other cultures on their own terms, which we also said has its limitations, and that it is impossible to do with 100% certainty, as we are always going to come at things from the perspective of our own culture, as well as there are some things that other cultures do which we generally find distasteful or intolerable. So a balance between those two things. We talked about the difference between subcultures and countercultures. Again, culture is not just one thing, it's often divided up into groups within the culture itself. Subcultures are definitely those groups that generally at least tend to support or are looked on favorably by the culture at large, whereas when we talk about countercultures, we talk about groups that are usually at least in opposition to one or more elements of the culture at large, or are looked at distrustfully or disfavorably by the culture at large. We listed modern American values. Some of the things we talked about when we talked about symbolic culture were things like values, mores, and sanctions. So we talked about modern American values. We gave a list of them and discussed them in some detail, as well as talking about things like value clusters and emerging values. And we wrapped up chapter 2 by talking then again about material culture. We talked about examples of material culture, but most specifically we talked about technology and the effects it has on culture as far as changing and shaping culture. We talked about issues such as cultural lag and cultural leveling as well. So again, topics you would want to be familiar with. Then in module 3, we discussed socialization. Socialization is that process that we go through as human beings to gain the ways of society. Again, as we talked about in module 2, culture is not natural, culture is learned. So socialization is the process by which we learn how to become social creatures. So we gave some examples of what happens when people aren't correctly or properly or appropriately socialized. We gave examples of feral children, isolated children, institutionalized children, and experiments that have been done on deprived animals to basically illustrate for us how important this process is. We talked about some theories about how we develop our sense of self. So again, microsociology, generally symbolic interactionists. We talked about Charles Horton Cooley and his idea of the looking glass self. We talked about George Herbert Mead and his ideas about the importance of play. We talked about Jean Piaget and his development of reason, as well as Sigmund Freud and some of the elements of the human personality as being all examples of ways in which we are socialized into the people that we are. We talked about the very important aspects of socialization in regard to gender. In other words, how society teaches the biological sexes of male and female how to act within society in terms of definitions of masculine and feminine. We talked about some of the very important aspects of society which we would consider agents of socialization. So those things that cause our change or enable our change in society into social creatures. We talked about the need for re-socialization. As we go through life, we continue to have to change and adapt to our social environment, and that is referred to as re-socialization. Again, giving some very specific examples, as well as some of the more extreme types of need for re-socialization, which we refer to as the total institution. And then we took a look at a generalized kind of fictional life course and see that we definitely pass through various stages in life, some which are social constructions that we make up basically to explain some of our need for socialization and re-socialization as we go through life. Okay, in module 4, then we started talking about how to look at society and analyze it from various perspectives. So we started with the idea of looking at society from a macro standpoint, looking at the very large elements of society, which we called analysis of the social structure. We talked about a couple of different ways that society could be described and broken down. We talked about the idea of ascribed versus achieved statuses within society. That there are statuses that we gain through our own activities and behavior, as well as some statuses which are largely involuntary or assigned to us. We talked about the idea that society has transformed over time. So we went through various explanations of the stages that society has gone through, and it's also important to recognize that those stages were prompted by generally advances in technology. So to study that section would be necessary to look at a society, say, like hunter-gatherers, and recognize what the social invention was, or the technological advancement that allowed society then to progress into the next stage. So we went through each of those stages, as well as a list of the inventions that occurred between them. And then we talked about, again, once referring back to Emile Durkheim, we talked about societal cohesion. What holds society together? And we had some different theories about that. Looking at society from a micro standpoint, in other words, looking at the behavior largely of individuals or small groups, We talked about you can look at society and understand the ways that we use stereotypes. Again, broad assumptions or assumptions about large numbers of people and their characteristics. We talked about Irving Goffman's theory of dramaturgy, the idea that we are all basically actors in a huge play in society, and that our behavior is sometimes dictated by the various roles that we play. He used analogies or metaphors such as front stage and backstage. We talked about ethnomethodology, that idea of just studying how people do things, and that we have a lot of assumptions about what we would consider to be appropriate or expected behavior, and what happens when we sometimes challenge those ideas in each other. And then we talked about the social construction of reality, whereas when people interact with each other, they can construct their own reality, and as long as the people who are interacting all agree on the same reality, then the consequences, for all intents and purposes, are real. All right? Then, in Module 5, we started talking about social groups. We talked about the importance of defining between what we call primary and secondary groups. Again, referring back to Charles Horton Cooley, we talked about his ideas about how important primary groups are and the distinctions between primary groups and secondary groups, where secondary groups tend to be larger, more formal, and generally a kind of voluntary association that we have. We talked about within society developing social networks and how we are attached to other people in society, and how as we recognize that we are attached to other people in society, we can expand our definition of exactly what it means to participate in society and interact with one another. We talked about Max Weber's theories about bureaucracies, about how society, as it's becoming more and more complex, is more and more likely then to take on, the organizations within society are to take on the characteristics of bureaucracies. And we came up with very specific definitions of what those characteristics are, and we talked about some of the both positive and negative aspects, according to Weber and Marx, about the effects on human behavior of operating within bureaucracies. And then we concluded that chapter by talking about group dynamics. In other words, how does interacting with other human beings affect our behavior? So we talked about some issues like the effects of group size on our behavior, the interactions that we have with other people. We also talked then about some things like the diffusion of responsibility when we get into groups. We talked about peer pressure, responses to authority, and then we concluded that by talking about a phenomenon known as groupthink. And then in Module 6, we talked about deviance. What happens, we know that society has, as we talked about all the way back in Module 2, when we talked about society's values, its norms or the rules for how we behave, and then the sanctions or the reactions of society. So in Chapter 6, we talked about deviance. What happens when we break the rules that society lays down for us? So we talked about various definitions or examples, and we recognize that there is a relativity to deviance, and that relativity is determined not by the action itself, but society's reaction to the action. So when we do something, the action by itself is not considered good or bad in sociological terms, but is purely defined by how society reacts to it. So we can clearly see that our behavior in association with the rules is relative, which is, again, the relativity of deviance. We talked about some symbolic interactionist theories about deviance. So we talked about phenomena such as labeling, and some other ways that if we look at the changing meanings of symbols in society, we can understand and explain why people break rules and follow others. We talked about some functional theories of deviance in society, what it means to, basically functionalists would look at deviance as being some form of dysfunction, but also talked about the idea that even deviance itself provides some functional views in society, according to, once again, Durkheim. And then conflict theories of deviance. So in other words, in the struggle between the various groups in society, what role does deviance play? And we clearly saw that typically we look at the idea of dominant versus subordinate groups and who controls the definitions of what it means to be deviant in society. We talked about some of the ways that society, especially our own, reacts to deviance. So we addressed some issues such as incarceration. We talked about the death penalty, among other issues. And then we talked about the societal goals to addressing deviance. So as a discipline, sociology acknowledges, of course, that there will be rule breaking within society, but if we look at kind of the idealized culture and how a society, quote unquote, should or should not handle the topic of deviance, then we listed very specific goals for that. And that's basically an overview of the modules that have been covered to this point in the semester. This is the material that you will be expected to comprehend for the exam. So once again, if you have further questions about this, feel free to post them in the Exam 1 discussion board, and they will be addressed. All right, thank you, and I hope everybody does well on Exam 1.